Have another question from our Zoom meeting for CJ. And the question is this. My dad has been eating a lot of unhealthy food. How do I help my dad eat healthier food? Every time we tell him to stop eating so much junk food, he stops eating for one day or two, but starts again.
That's a great question. How do you solve that? Well, aside from ourselves setting the example, let's imagine it's, do we know the age of the person? Is this a child? Or
I believe it's probably a child, yes.
Okay. So if you want to change somebody else's behavior, obviously the first step is changing yourself. But really for them, I would talk to them about what their goal is. Because if the individual doesn't see a problem, they're not going to change. But in the question, they mentioned that their dad has tried a couple of times, that he'll change for a day or two and then drift back. So probably the dad at least acknowledges something needs to change. So the question for that then becomes, how do you help your dad follow through on an exercise program? I would talk to him, whoever you are, I would talk to your dad, and ask your dad, what is your goal? Ask your dad, Dad, what's your goal? Or, depending upon the circumstance, Dad, do you think something needs to change? Or you could even more generally express it as concern and say, Dad, I'm concerned about you. I care about you. I'm worried that some of the choices you're making are not necessarily the healthiest choices. And I love you and I care for you. We're over here? Can't tell where we are. So I'm concerned you may not be making the healthiest choices. And I'm worried about that. Dad, is that something you're concerned about as well? And maybe your dad's already thinking about those things. So a lot of it depends upon your age and the relationship you have. If you're 10 years of age, you might be able to have a conversation, but you may not be able to improve your dad changing overnight. Doesn't mean you can't get your dad to change overnight. I remember one circumstance when I was in my 20s, one of the first leadership examples. There was a dad who was smoking. He was chain smoking. And the kid, maybe 8 or 10 years of age, knew that smoking was bad. But how does a 10-year-old get their parent to change? And so they'd had conversations and they'd heard in school that, you know, smoking is very bad for you, smoking can kill you. And the child finally went to the dad and said, and this is somebody that I know, and said, Daddy, do you love me? He says, yeah. And the child says, well, do you love me enough to quit smoking? And Dad's like, oh. It's like a knife through his heart, right? And so the child says, Daddy, I'm crying because I'm scared that you're going to die, and I want you to be there on my wedding day and to meet your grandkids when I have my own babies. And I'm scared that you're going to keep doing this, and I'm not going to have you later in my life. And so the child had no authority over the dad, no formal influence, but boy, oh boy, that was relationship leadership. And so the dad, it broke his heart into a million pieces as he started to realize the picture the child had painted, that he would arrive at his wedding and the dad wouldn't be there. The child would grow up and have kids and the dad wouldn't be there. And so he resolved, and he literally said these words. He says, okay, I'm going to stop quitting. I'm going to quit smoking because I love you. And if you ever, this dad literally said this, if you ever see me smoking a cigarette, what that means is I don't love you. And from that day, that dad never touched a cigarette. Ever. Because he had told the child, if you ever see me smoking a cigarette, it means I don't love you. So even if the dad was reaching because of the physical temptation with the nicotine receptors in his brain, the chemical addiction, he'd be like, oh, how can I look my child in the face and say, have him know I don't love him? And so he was able to get reach the threshold moment and get leverage on himself to change. So I would say, hey, Dad, you know, I'm concerned about you. I love you. I really think you need to change. And start there, and then point your dad towards some resources, like a personal trainer or take him into a gym. That'd be a next step. Hopefully that helps.
Great. Thank you, CJ, for your answer, and thank you, Caitlin, for the question. Now, in addition, if I may just add to that, the way I would do it is go to the pantry that your dad put his snacks there. Put something else there next time. For example, put a bag of carrots, put a bag of tomatoes or something like that, and see how he reacts to that. And then finally, one day he'll say, "Oh, my kids is sending me a message. Okay, time for me to change my eating habits." Because sometimes, well, this is from my opinion, right? Sometimes kids find it hard to express their feelings to their parents because because they're worried about what they're going to say might hurt them.
Sure.
Because they're young, right? Because they're not sure what to say.
Yeah.
So instead of doing that, maybe try doing something passive, like for example, the example that I gave you, and see if they act differently. So that's just my little 2 cents.
That's a great suggestion as well. That's a great suggestion.